Hello and welcome to Cookery with Mason Storm. On today's episode we're going to look at making some chicken soup. Of course this isn't normal chicken soup. This is chicken rice soup. Ingredients for such a soup are diverse in nature, but vary in the quantity. And this is more of a template than an exact blueprint for the planned assemblance of such a soup. As such, I have chosen to use chicken tenders instead of chicken breasts, mainly due to the price reduction at the grocery store. Other ingredients include rice, standard onion, carrots, green onion, celery, cloves of garlic, salt and pepper, coconut milk to thicken, and broth. I have chosen to use chicken broth and vegetable broth. This is mainly due to only having one carton of chicken broth. As with many soups of this nature, the vegetables I have selected are too large and need to be cut into smaller pieces. Okay, so we're going to cut up these vegetables. So I'm going to start with the celery because celery is always really easy to do. So just removing the ends and the bad spots at this point in time. Give them a bit of a wash because they're not looking the greatest. But all is good. Now our goal with cutting our vegetables here is going to make them so that they're bite size. So when you get a spoonful of this soup, you'll be able to have multiple vegetables on it at the same time of a different variety. And that really enhances the flavor and the taste and the experience, the texture when it comes to the consumption of soup. So what we're doing here is a single slash across the length of the celery, and then it's kind of a medium-sized dice. I'm just throwing them back in the bowl that I was originally displaying them in the first segment of this video series on the creation of soup. And celery goes pretty quick. It's usually one of the quickest vegetables to do, and I usually like doing it first. It's a good way to get warmed up. Now that we're all warmed up, it's time to move on to a more difficult and advanced vegetable. This is the carrot. And we're going to first remove the tips and then cut it in half and then use the flats to cut it in half again. Now there is a big taper on the carrots, so when you're cutting your slices you want to cut accordingly to try to make the size the same. And when it comes to cutting it lengthwise, be very careful. You don't want to cut yourself. I like to have my fingers far away from the blade when I'm cutting, especially on the lengthwise cuts. Always something to be aware of, and stay aware while you're cutting your carrots. This last one here was kind of tricky. It didn't want to cut evenly. It's a really funny shaped carrot. Something must have happened to it while it was growing, but with a little time and patience it'll turn out okay. Now we're going to cut our green onions, and first I'm going to get rid of the rooty parts, and then it's just a bunch of fine slices. Green onion is very easy to cut, and when you cut multiple at once like this, it goes by incredibly quick. So that's just something to be aware of. The more things you cut at once, the faster you're done. And now that we're done with our green onion, we can move on to our standard onion. And I used half of this onion in the previous video, that's why it's not completely round. And we're just going to do a dice. So several cross cuts and then chopping the opposite direction. And it goes incredibly quick. The trick is to have your fingers on the root so to hold it together while you slice. This wasn't the perfect example of an onion for this because it still kind of fell apart on me. But sometimes that happens and you just need to roll with the punches and do what you can. No onion's gonna cut perfectly all the time. And now that we're done with our onion, it's time for our final vegetable, our last one. And it's now our garlic. So I'm just going to take the ends off of it. I've already peeled them, so that's most of the work already gone. Then I crush them with the knife, and then I slice them with the knife. Get nice small pieces, and then we're good to go. There are all our vegetables prepared. Now all we have left to work on is, of course, the meat. And now that my board's nice and clean, we're just going to slice up our little chicken tenders here. If you had breast, you would cut them up in the same kind of general way. you just would have a couple cross cuts to make sure they're all small bite-sized pieces. Either way, it goes pretty quick, and once your meat's done being cut, then it's good to move on to the next step. Now we can see our real starting ingredients. But it's time to get going. So we'll get our pot on the stove, we'll set our temperature to a medium high, and then we'll start with adding our onions to the pot. We're going to start with getting some color on our onions. So a little bit of olive oil, and we're just going to let them cook here for about 5 minutes. First they'll get a little bit transparent, and then they'll get a little bit more color. And when that happens, we can add our chicken. And then with the chicken, we're going to stir it around, we're going to let it cook down a little bit, get a little bit of color on the chicken, and then we can move on to the real soup making soup. Now the rest of the vegetables can join the onion in the soup. So we're going to add our carrots, our celery, and then we're going to add our green onions and the garlic. Perfect. And once we have all of our vegetables in, then we'll start adding all of our broth. So the only thing that's not in it right now is the rice, salt and pepper, and the coconut milk. Now we play a little bit of a waiting game. So what we're going to do is we're going to wait until our soup gets hot enough that it starts to boil, and then we're going to reduce the temperature to a simmer. This can take quite a bit of time. It really depends. That's a lot of broth to add to a soup, so expect this to take 15 minutes possibly. And then once it starts to boil away, we just reduce the heat, and then we let it cook for another hour or so, stirring every now and then to make sure nothing gets stuck to the bottom and burns, because that would be awful. You don't need to baby it too extensively. It can kind of look after itself, but do stir it occasionally. Now I'm going to add my rice now that it's been about an hour. And the trick to the rice is you don't want your stuff to be too tender when you put it in. You want it to have some tenderness though, because you don't want to have your soup be mush, like completely, and you don't want your rice to be mush. So there's kind of a little bit of a fine balance there. And then once your rice is added, same thing, cook it for a long period of time till your stuff is the tenderness that you desire. And then when our target tenderness is achieved, then we can add our coconut milk. And once we add our coconut milk, we can cook it for another 5-10 minutes, or whenever it starts to thicken up. Add salt and pepper, stir it for a little while, taste it. If it's not salt and peppery enough, add more of whichever one you want. And then you're done, and you can eat it. This soup is pretty easy to make, and I've also made it in the crock pot before, and I've had very good results doing that. If you're doing it in the crock pot, you can just make it in the morning, and then when you come home from work, you have something delicious to eat. Although when you make it in the crock pot, you usually just do everything all at once and just let it cook away. So the stovetop version is definitely a little bit superior, but the crock pot version is still quite delicious. So let me know how you make your chicken soup, and if you like this video, please like and subscribe. And until next time, stay awesome.